Welcome to A Chorus. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. This is my daily video and podcast that goes out with an email newsletter via my Substack called the Kaka, which is all about Aotearoa's political economy around housing, climate and poverty. Today I wanted to focus on supermarkets, which are one of the reasons the cost of living in Aotearoa is so high. A big chunk of our economy, particularly for the things we use the most and which people who spend 100% of their income on daily life have to use a lot of those industries are effectively captured and run by monopolies, duopolies. I'm talking here about supermarkets where there's a duopoly involving Foodstuffs, which owns Pak'nSave and New World, and Woolworths. Insurance, where home insurance is 60% owned by IAG, which owns NZI, State and AMI. Banking, where we've got four big banks, which a bunch of official reviews have found are amongst the most profitable in the world. Our electricity sector, the so-called gentailers, the big four, three of which are 51% owned by the government, also producing record high profits and administering significant price increases, currently running at 3 times the rate of inflation. We also have fuel retailing, where profit margins have increased again in recent years after some intervention at the margins. And this is symptomatic of significant sectors of our economy where over time either state-owned operations, which had monopolies, were bought by private interests, or areas where there had been significant competition have consolidated, i.e. the biggest player has bought out the next biggest player and wasn't blocked by the Commerce Commission. And so over time, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, in various sectors we've had a concentration of ownership, which has allowed profit margins to rise. Now, this is not surprising to many consumers, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 years when there was a burst of inflationary pressure around the world, which resulted in what's called greed inflation, not just here, but all over the world, where players who had significant market strength used the opportunity of rising prices because of rising commodity prices to expand their profit margins. And New Zealand's supermarkets, of course, is the main focus right now because we have certainly seen profits and prices rise strongly in supermarkets. And yesterday, the government made some decisions and proposals about improving competition in the supermarket sector. Long story short, the government yet again, as we saw with the previous Labour government, bailed out and decided not to do a full structural separation of the supermarkets duopoly. This has been something considered for nearly 10 years now. There's been market studies, there's been supermarket inquiries, the Commerce Commission has looked at things during COVID and after COVID, immediately after COVID. The previous Labour government looked at it, and in the end decided that taking on these two duopolies was too difficult, and the government of the day could choose to misdirect people into saying that various competitive measures would be applied. Nicola Willis talked a good game in the last couple of years about taking significant action to try to reduce these profit margins and improve profitability, and included looking at the idea of breaking up the duopoly. Now, this could take various forms, but the one that's been discussed most is essentially creating 2 sets of wholesale delivery centres. Currently, the 2 main chains have 3 big warehouses each, one in Auckland, one in Palmerston North, one in Christchurch. And the idea was that there would be a couple of new ones built, and essentially those a new competitor would have access to one of those big wholesale distribution centres. Nicola Willis announced yesterday that she's not going ahead with that. She says she's still got it in her back pocket, but the number of times the threat of structural separation has been in the back pocket of politicians and nothing happened is frankly beyond a joke now. Nicola Willis says that she wants to give the supermarket chains access to the fast track legislation to remove consenting barriers and allow them to build new supermarkets. But that is clearly not attractive enough for the likes of Lidl and Aldi and Tesco and Sainsbury's to launch here. And the one significant international player who has challenged the duopoly in the last few years, which is Costco, the US chain, has only built one store, a mega store, it has to be said, in West Auckland, which has, in that part of Auckland, improved competition and prices. And the great white hope, so to speak, of supermarket reform is that Costco will look to launch in the rest of the country. Costco has said in the request for proposals that Nicola Willis put out in recent months, has said that they are interested. However, essentially Nicola Willis is betting everything on Costco taking on the big two. There's a problem with that. Firstly, Costco already has a consent to open a big store in Hornsby in Christchurch. And to be frank, there's only ever going to be one other Costco store in New Zealand which can be supported by a population big enough for one of those stores, and that is Christchurch. At best, you would expect in the long run that Costco could have perhaps one store in Auckland, one in Hamilton, and maybe one in Christchurch. This is not going to help those smaller cities and towns where currently Woolworths and Pack and Save have carved up those cities into virtual monopolies based on particular catchments where most people don't drive more than 10 or 20 minutes to a supermarket. And in large parts of the country, there are many areas where there is just one supermarket within a 10 to 20 minute drive. Right, just to summarise what happened yesterday and why our supermarket sector and, frankly, the rest of our economy remains still captured after all of these years. Nicola Willis announced that she wasn't going ahead with structural separation. She wants to use fast track instead. Costco says they're interested, but again, they've got a Christchurch consent. They got it in 2022 and haven't used it. There's no sign of a stall there. Aldi, Lidl, Sainsbury, Tesco are not saying they're interested in moving to New Zealand. Frankly, we don't have the population base to support significant competition. Getting in and launching a competitive chain would be very expensive, not just building stores, but setting up networks of supply, and you're talking decades of loss making before you got anywhere. And New Zealand just isn't big enough for that. Just to reiterate just how profitable the supermarkets are, this is a chart from the Commerce Commission's August 6 annual grocery report looking at the earnings before interest and tax margins for various supermarket chains around the world. You can see there the most profitable is Foodstuffs North Island, FSNI, and Foodstuffs South Island, the two red bars there at 7% and 6%. Woolworths Australia actually at the moment, Woolworths New Zealand is not very profitable, although it did just report yesterday higher profit margins and got rid of its CEO last year because of it essentially losing the battle with Foodstuffs. And Foodstuffs combined 6 to 7%, basically twice the profitability levels of the likes of Tesco. And just to reiterate, Costco, good for West Auckland. If you're willing to once every 2 months drive a truck there, fill it up and come home, and you have a suite of freezers big enough to put everything in, that makes sense. But it's not going to work for the average consumer in Pukekohe or in Hamilton or Karori. Just to reinforce, I'm not the only one saying this, this is the Grocery Action Group's chair, Sue Chetwin, who came out yesterday, saying that breaking up this entrenched duopoly is the single most effective course of action if New Zealanders want to see lower prices at the checkout and to see them quickly. That's the story here. New Zealand is a captured economy. And just to, again, reinforce that what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years, you can see here that grocery food prices typically over time have followed commodity food prices globally. And whenever there's a gap that opens up between the global food prices and the domestic food prices in supermarkets, that is a higher profit margin. And in fact, we just saw through 2021 to 3 the biggest expansion in profit margins in New Zealand's history. And that's partly because the industry is now much more concentrated than it's ever been. You might recall about 20 years ago, Food Town essentially was bought out. And we also saw various attempts, firstly by the Warehouse and a couple of others, to get into the market were blocked by the two big chains, who've been very effective at effectively buying up empty plots, land banking them, and using the ability through the Resource Management Act to block new competitors from coming in. And essentially the market has settled down into a series of monopolies around these drivable catchments. And when there was heat in the market, pressure in the market, the supermarket duopolies took their opportunity, in particular Foodstuffs, North Island and South Island, to grow their profit margins. It's one of the reasons New Zealand is so expensive, along with others. There is an exception, though, one area where the tough decision to break up a monopoly was made. And that was way back in at the beginning of the 2000s, when telecommunications monopoly, in fact, it had turned into a duopoly by then with Vodafone in both mobile and landline, was essentially broken up by the then Labour government with David Cunliffe and Helen Clark. They took a lot of heat. They essentially legislated to break it up, and that led, along with the arrival of 2 Degrees, who only arrived after the breakup, and were reassured there would be a competitive opportunity, along with a couple of tweaks here and there in rules such as number portability and mobile termination fees. That meant we had true competition in the market, the growth of 2 Degrees, and now some of the lowest broadband and mobile data prices in our comparative countries, a much better rollout of ultra-fast broadband than in Australia. And it's the one area of the economy where there is true competition because of that structural separation that was done. And yet again, and we've seen it too in electricity, the government of the day, both National and Labour, have chosen not to take on the established players who have used their ability to lobby and argue their case with the main players in both parties very effectively. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was today's Daily Chorus for Thursday, the 28th of August. Ka kite anō.